I'm with Mr. Kelly, CTO of Adtran, and I would like to make you a few questions about Adtran, about your overall presence, and let's start how Adtran was founded.
So, great question. Adtran was founded over 35 years ago now, and it was originally set up in the United States in a location in Alabama called Huntsville. And our founder, Mark Smith, set up the company when AT&T at the time was a monopoly operator across the United States, and AT&T had created a company to supply it with the telecoms equipment it needed to deliver its services, and that company was called Western Electric. So there was a scenario where you had a monopoly operator that was buying its telecoms equipment from a monopoly vendor that it had created. And when the regulators on the United States side forced AT&T to divest into the Baby Bell companies, those smaller regional operators were no longer obliged to buy their telecoms equipment from Western Electric. So our founder, Mark Smith, saw a great opportunity to be able to go in there and offer something much more competitive than what that monopoly vendor was able to offer. So Adtran was created. It grew extremely well in the United States market, where when I joined the company over 12 years ago, a common statement within the company was, if your phone call in the United States travels over a T1 line, it travels over an Adtran T1 line. They had like 90+% market penetration in T1 service delivery, so they grew really, really well. About 20 years ago, we started to expand into the European side of things, initially organically, but then we decided to increase our expansion through acquisition, and we acquired the broadband access division of Nokia Siemens Networks, and that gave us a really strong presence outside of North America, where we had over 80 international accounts, and we had 300 employees, 330 employees I think it was, here in Europe, and we still largely have that number of employees from that acquisition today. More recently, we've taken a further step to expand our activities and increase our presence in Europe, where in October of 2021, we announced the acquisition of ADVA Networks. ADVA Optical is an optical transport company, and we're in the final stages of closing out that deal subject to German regulatory requirements, which we're confident, given our track record in Germany because of the Nokia Siemens acquisition, that we'll be in good shape on that side of things. So overall, the new Adtran, the new rebranded Adtran that we see here at the show today, overall that's going to give us a presence of over 1,000 employees here in Europe. I think it's like 1,300. But also, most importantly, from a revenue split perspective, half of our revenues are going to come out of the European side of the business and the other half out of the North American side of the business. So it's a much more balanced organization as we go forward, which means our European customers here are going to have a much louder voice when it comes to defining the roadmap, which is always really important.
Thank you. Tell us more about your advantages. What are your advantages comparing to the competition?
Sure. So the real advantage that Adtran brings to operators, large and small, is we bring an open portfolio to the table. And what I mean by that is, our solutions do not lock a vendor in or lock an operator in that they must buy our equipment going forward. If you look at traditional approaches for broadband access equipment, they're traditionally delivered in a chassis form factor, and once an operator selects their chassis, then they're forced to buy all the line cards that fill that chassis to connect customers from that same vendor. And as a result, that operator's roadmap is determined by that vendor. If that vendor doesn't innovate quickly enough, doesn't drive down things like power consumption, doesn't bring new capabilities to the platform, then the operator themselves are held back. With what we bring to the table, we bring an open disaggregated portfolio that allows the operators, should they choose to mix between different hardware vendors if they want to. They can even mix in software to run on that hardware from different locations. So today in Europe, I've got operators that take our disaggregated OLTs and they take software stacks from the likes of the Open Networking Foundation and they load them to run directly on the box, so they're not running the Adtran software at all. I've got other customers that take the same equipment and they deploy that completely with the Adtran software and management solutions. And then I've other customers that have taken some of our hardware, like our OLTs, and then they've taken aggregation components from other switching vendors and they've loaded the Adtran network operating system onto those third-party aggregation switches. So we're the only vendor in the industry that really offers that choice where an operator can pick and choose where they get their hardware from, where they get their software from, and can intermix those together. As we bring ADVA together, ADVA will bring the optical transport elements of it, and their ethos is very, very similar to Adtran's ethos, where they're focused on open disaggregation as well. So we're going to have a unique portfolio offering that will deliver from the data center right through to the Wi-Fi in the home across an open set of components on an end-to-end portfolio basis.
What are the challenges that you are facing mainly in the European market?
Scale would be the biggest challenge that we face at the moment. So what we've seen across the board here in Europe now is the European Commission, working with the national regulators, have put in place a regulatory and legal foundation for all of Europe's EU 27 nations to roll out gigabit-ready infrastructure. And the way they've worded the legislation under the European Electronic Communications Code and within the VHCN, the Very High Capacity Networks definition, is essentially the infrastructure must be built with fibre. So what we're seeing now is an explosion in activity in building out new fibre. Some of it's funded with government funding. A huge portion of it is funded from private equity getting involved in the industry. And what we're trying to do now as an organisation is scale our activities in a sustainable fashion so that we can get out to all the operators across all those countries that are making the investments and drive awareness of the benefits of the solution, the open disaggregated solution that we bring to the market.
Do you think that Europe is a little bit back comparing to other continents?
Yes and no. So if I look at some of the early adopters in Europe, the likes of the Spanish and the Portuguese market, you know, they're approaching, you know, ubiquitous fibre coverage at this point in time. So they've done really, really well. However, because they started their journey, you know, 7-8 years ago, the technology that they're lighting that fibre with now is beginning to reach the end of its usable lifespan from the point of view that they're lighting with GPON technology. What we're seeing in other markets that have started out later, markets like the United Kingdom, they've leapfrogged the original first generation PON technology, GPON technology, and instead they're lighting it now with the 10 gigabit capable XGS PON technology. So if I look at the United Kingdom now, even though it started late with its fibre rollout, it's now the most advanced PON market in the world because the vast majority of the operators that are building out their PON networks are lighting that PON with XGS PON technologies. So there's pros and cons with Europe's status at this point in time. There are still some of the countries, though, that really need to begin to accelerate their build-out programs. We see this with Belgium, we see it with Germany. Italy still has a bit of ground to catch up as well.
What about Greece?
Greece also. Greece needs to get behind the investment in fibre. The movement is beginning to happen. That's the really positive thing. And what we're seeing again is because they're getting a little bit later getting started, they now have this one-time opportunity to really embrace the new architectures as well as the new XGS-PON technologies.
Okay. One more question that I would like to ask you is okay, we had the COVID-19 crisis, we still have this crisis, we have the semiconductor crisis, and now the unfortunate Ukrainian war. Does this bad situation affect you? Affects your productivity or everything? Or
I think any vendor that tries to tell their customers that they're not impacted by this is being disingenuous. They're not being truthful. There are a lot of challenges that go with it. Our supply chain team have performed heroics over the last couple of years to make sure we have not let down our customers, to make sure we continue to deliver against the build programs that they've signed up for with their investors. We've worked very, very closely at the beginning of all these crises to make sure we had very clear visibility of their forecasts so that we could ensure that we had all the components that we needed to deliver the products. But more recently, what we've also done, and this has been reflected in our bottom line profitability, is we've taken on a huge amount of additional inventory on the component side to make sure that we can continue to manufacture all of the products that we need, as well as take on board any surprise wins that we might get with new customers or any expansion and build-out programs that a customer might bring to the table that's not forecasted. So we're now holding record levels of inventory within the business to make sure we can cope with that. Unfortunately, you know, prudence of running a business, you wouldn't normally see companies holding that level of inventory, but thankfully, due to the cash reserves that Adtran has available to us, on the back of 35 years of being run as a prudent company, we're able to take on board that inventory and meet the needs of all of our customers. As we go forward, we continually scan the market and look at options for diversification, both on the manufacturing side of things, but even on the component supply side of things as well. So it's something strategically that we take very seriously.
Okay. One more question. Which technology you think that it will prevail 4 years from now?
We're at the very beginning of the deployment lifecycle of XGS-PON technology, which, just to recall, delivers 10 gigabits per second in the downstream direction and 10 gigabits per second in the upstream direction. If we reflect as an industry on the first major PON technology, which was GPON technology, GPON is 18 years old this year, approaching 20 years old, and it will continue to be deployed for new builds for a number of years to come and hasn't yet hit saturation point. So we anticipate that XGS-PON, delivering 4 times the downstream capacity and 8 times the upstream capacity, will continue to be the mass market deployment technology for the next 10 years. It will probably have a life cycle that's similar to GPON, where it gets close to 20 years before we move to the next step. Now, the next step is being worked on within the standards. It's called G.HSP, and that's 50 gig symmetric PON that they're working on. So it's a major step forward. But I think what we need to do for the moment is make sure that we're very cost effectively meeting the needs of Europe's gigabit society, and that's where XGS-PON is a perfect technology for delivering that. And then as advancements in the chipsets continue, so things like power consumption come down, but also density of compute continues to increase, then we'll be able to bring 50 gig PON in the future for a similar price point to what we currently do with XGS-PON. And that's really, really important. We can't have show ponies in the industry that can deliver lots of capacity but are beyond the reach for large-scale residential-style deployments. And we saw that with NG-PON 2. It promised a lot for the industry, this wavelength-separated PON technology, but the cost structure was completely out of line with what the industry needed for large-scale deployment. So that's why we believe fundamentally that XGS-PON technology will be the main technology deployed over the next 4 years, but also the transition of the industry in preparation for the next generation PON technologies. They will move increasingly over to disaggregated OLT solutions so that they're not constrained by the inherent backplane restrictions that chassis-based systems have built into them and designed into them from the very beginning. It's only when you go disaggregated will you be able to bring on 50 gig PON, and beyond that in the future 100 gig or 200 gig coherent PON in a non-blocking fashion.